all right. Hey, guys, welcome back to the Jesus culture, Yeshua culture, rather. All right. I'm gonna react to a very important, I would deem a very important topic or subject that I think is concerning to a lot of Christians. It's also concerning to both Christians and non-Christians. I think it's a social discussion that has confused plenty of people and is probably maybe the most commonly and widely debated topics right now, especially in South Africa. And this is, I'm just gonna pioneer it based off an interview that Oprah Winfrey opened up about her childhood experience, a childhood trauma. That I think a lot of you will probably find that it resonates with you as well. So I'm just gonna get into it. She's being interviewed by Dr. Oz. Those who don't know, Dr. Oz is one of those individuals who used to be people who had a segment in Oprah Winfrey's, you know, back in the then Oprah Winfrey show. We saw a lot of people like Dr. Phil, have their own TV shows after that. And shout out to Oprah for really opening up those doors because she initiated the whole thing. It was like, hey, you know what? We could create a TV show around you and just you only. And she's one of those people. So, all right, let's do this, man.
I'm back with my friend and mentor, Oprah Winfrey, who is opening up like never before about trauma in her childhood. It's all part of her new book, What Happened to You, where she explores how trauma in our past informs who we are today. So, Oprah, you've been very open about the physical abuse you suffered growing up. In the book, you tell a heartbreaking story of a particular beating on a Sunday morning before church. It seemed so innocent what you were doing. What happened?
Well, first of all, I want to say my grandmother is the reason I am able to stand here today, sit here today. She did the best she could. She was a maid, was a domestic worker her entire life, and never would not have imagined in this lifetime the life that I now am able to live. But like so many.
Listen, I just gotta say, I don't think any of us can imagine the kind of life that Oprah would have. Like, if Oprah was like my cousin or my niece or sister, I would not even imagine that they would become this kind of an iconic figure, entrepreneur, the kind of business mogul that she's become. I don't think anyone would have imagined a black child, a girl for that matter, would really get to this level of success. Okay.
Parents of that era, caregivers of that area, particularly in the Black community, corporal punishment, whipping your kids, beating your kids was just common. It was, I grew up in a household with my grandmother. It was just my grandmother and my grandfather the first 6 years of my life. And I grew up under the auspices of children are seen and not heard. So me, Oprah Winfrey, not being heard in an environment where if you talk too much or you look the wrong way or you spoke out of turn, my grandmother would just turn and just thump me on the head. And many times she would save up the whippings for Saturday night when you were naked. And so I remember this morning, I had been asked to go to the well to bring some water back. And as I was bringing the water back, I was like playing with the water with my fingers like that in the water. And my grandmother was looking out the window. And when I brought the bucket in and I'm sloshing the bucket because I'm a little girl, and she's like, "What? Were you playing in that water? Did you have your fingers in that water? That's our drinking water." And I was like, and I said, "No, ma'am." And she said, "I saw you and your fingers in the water." So she, grabbed a switch and I got a really bad whipping for it. And
Listen, now, yeah, a lot of us probably, if you had grandparents, I'm pretty sure you would notice that it's very difficult to relate with grandparents because they are like they come from some of the most strictest of backgrounds. Now, just notice how as she's talking, that the tone and the pace in her voice changes with time as she remembers what happened. It changes gradually. There's something about that I'm gonna get to
later, when I put on my clothes to go to church, one of the welts from my back opened up and bloodied the dress. So
yeah. Now imagine getting a whoop so much, so hard that when you wear clothes and you're sitting, one of the wounds open and it bloodies the shirt. Okay, now there's a fine line between child discipline, of course, there's discipline and child abuse and so forth. Okay, I'm going to talk about that a little bit later. Now, there's something that happened there when she was relaying the story or conveying her experiences as a child. And whenever I talk to people, I talk about when you hear a person talking and they sound like they can't relate with people or they can't relate with people's experiences. I always say, look at their childhood. Okay, it takes an inhumane type of a person or somebody who will probably be maybe suffering from psychopathy. Oh goodness, not psychology, psychopathy. Who probably lacks the ability to feel certain emotions, like empathy towards people. But it's very difficult for a person to not relate and empathize with another human being. The best way you can empathize with another human being is through your childhood. The child in every one of us knows what it feels like to be mistreated or to be made fun of or to be bullied or whatever the case may be. And we tend to bury all of that stuff within us in some way, but then it resurfaces in some way. Okay, so people can empathize with a child's experiences. And when she's remembering these experiences, it's interesting how it then resurfaces, but how she interprets it and how it affects her in her life. She talks about this a little later on. It's really interesting. I'm just going to let her talk and we're going to get to that later on. So I'm going to let her finish about something that she talks about, child discipline, and then we're going to get into that.
My emotion now is not because I feel such deep pain about it. I just feel pain for that little girl. I feel like now I know what it's like to be, you look at a 3, 4-year-old, 5-year-old child and how innocent they are. And at the time I just accepted it. I just thought, okay, I got a whipping. And that was one of many whippings. And, my grandmother was the kind of person, and I know a lot of people watching, you had this too in your family. You get whipped, then they'd be annoyed that you were still sulking about it. And she'd come along and say, you better wipe that frown off your face.
Yeah, just before we get into that. Yeah, so yeah, man, they were like, you better wipe that frown off your face. I remember that, They get really pissed off that you're crying. Then they beat you more for crying even more. So I think parents have done. I think a lot of us Africans have dealt with all of these things. Look, it's not a secret that Africans in general, whether it's African American, African anything, because of a lot of the history that we've endured generationally, there's a lot of trauma embedded in what people experience in their past and how that somehow then affected the next generation, their children, in line in how they raise their children and so forth, because there's a lot of trauma that's undealt with. Guys, therapy is not for white people only. Okay, it's not a white people thing, it's an everybody thing. It's just therapeuticizing is all about being able to talk and freeing yourself from something that you find hard to either discuss or to disclose with anybody. So all right, so here's the thing. Now, when it comes to the matter of child discipline, it's very interesting that it's Oprah who's bringing all these stories up, because if you remember, she came to South Africa and had a school built in Henley or Clip, if I'm not mistaken, and she raised a concern about discipline, and she was like, you're not gonna beat the kids up. Hopefully no beating. Hopefully the kids are not gonna get any beating, because corporal punishment, well, I'm in South Africa, well known for corporal punishment, but it's such a difficult conversation to have because you're talking to different generations and different societies. We are one of the most uneven societies in South Africa, or in the world, actually, in Africa or anywhere, because you have different levels of societies, social structures that inform and affect a lot of the topics that we deal with and talk about. So when you talk about corporal punishment or child discipline, you got a situation where the government has legislated that you cannot beat a child, you cannot slap a child, smack them on the head or whatever the case is. Now, here's a problem with that. You got a situation where I think a lot of parents, they agree that, of course, there's a difference between disciplining and abuse and going too far. but they're using the methods that they've always known to work, what is accessible to them, because how many options do they really have? Now, I've heard some people on radio and everywhere else, they're so-called educated, those who come from certain backgrounds or who have had the privileges of certain kind of education, who said, well, there's a lot of research that proves that there are different ways of disciplining a child. If you want to be telling me about things like, I don't know, timeouts or grounding children or taking away their privileges and etc., look, that might work with some kids to some degree and to some extent, but that will be informed by the social structures that inform how the people's orientation and how they raise their kids, and their access to certain infrastructure goes on to impact what they can implement and what they can't implement. Okay, because okay, let's just talk about the idea of taking away privileges. How many privileges do you think a child living in the rural place, rural place where, maybe they're being raised by a single mother, or they're in a place where, the unemployment rate is extremely high. You're talking about a situation where there's not a lot of extramural activities. There's not a lot of, there's just not a lot. They are the most underprivileged, underserved communities, but yet you are giving them this knowledge that comes from people who are overly privileged with lots of options. Now, what are the parameters that I'm talking about here? That, or rather, the some of the uneven think. There's an uneven thinking that doesn't really do justice to the conversation, in a sense that someone who's raising a child in a rural place have a lot at stake. Okay, that child could make one of the worst decisions in their life. They could face imprisonment. Okay, they could, get addicted to drugs, join a gang, become a gangster, join a gang, or whatever the case may be. It just takes that one small decision. Now, if the child doesn't want to listen, come back home late at night or whatever, they know what's at stake, because those are the kinds of communities that they're dealing with. And it's not going to take scolding them and shouting at them and whatever, because you're talking about, let's take a single mother raising a young man, for instance. He's going to want to look for validation elsewhere, in all kinds of places. It's quite difficult for parents, and when you say they must take away a certain measure of discipline, that is only accessible to them if they start smacking the kid for whatever reason, when they see that the kid is just starting to, when they're in that stage of adolescence, they're just starting to mingle with the wrong crowd, and you're saying they can't even do that. What options do they have? You understand what I'm saying? So it's a widely contested and widely debated issue that is quite difficult, because there's a lot of other factors that have to be looked into. It's not just about research, but research from where, conducted from where, by who. Is it hard data based on which communities? A lot of information that's being legislated right now does not inform the South African living conditions right now, and that's one of the biggest factors. Never mind the fact that, yes, bearing in mind, yes, child discipline or child beating up kids to a point where they bleed and things like that, like what Oprah went through. Obviously, that's a discussion that has to be had. Children have to be protected. Children have the right to be protected from such hazardous activities as such, or whatever the case is. They need to be protected from those types of ruthless, outlandish kind of treatments. And there's a lot of them too. But again, it comes back to the discussion around who's raising them, So it's a community, societal issue. It's embedded in a lot of different things that have to be discussed. I don't think they can be legislated. I don't think legislature is gonna really resolve that or help people to navigate these spaces easy at all, or successfully at all, rather. Then we get to the religious aspect of the conversation. Folks will say, hey, the Bible says that my son despise not the chastening of the Lord. Okay, and then you got things like, other scriptures such as Proverbs 29:17, which is discipline your children and they will give you peace. They will bring you the delights you desire. So it all comes back to, then there's other scriptures such as Hebrew chapter 12, and you have forgotten the exhortation which speaks unto you as unto children. My son, despise you not the, my goodness gracious, King James. No, man. just change the version, shall we? Any other version will do, thanks. Yes, I think English Standard Version is fine by me. Have you forgotten the exhortation that addresses you as sons? My son, do not regard lightly the discipline of the Lord, nor be weary when reproved by him. For the Lord disciplines the one he loves, and chastises every son whom he receives. And this is the one that most of us really go into. Proverbs 13 verse 24. Whoever spares the rod hates their children, but the one who loves their children is careful to discipline them. All right, so there's always the word discipline is what really comes across in most of these cases and situations. So let's do a little bit of a word study on that, because in Hebrew, the word Musa meant discipline, and it usually came with the idea of, okay, it's chastening, it's correcting, but there is a discussion to be had around that. Not literally. So in terms of biblical interpretation principles, you don't necessarily, we don't quickly run to interpreting the text as literal. We take it literal as it is when we've considered all other possibilities. Other than that, consider it as metaphorical if it is ambiguous. Okay, I don't think you can beat a child with a rod, man. I mean, that's just like crazy. You want to kill them or what? You know what I'm saying? So I think intention really matters when it comes to that. So, my son, despise not the chastising of the Lord. That's Proverbs 6:20, the one that we just read, which has a lot to do with the word Musa, because the word Musa denotes fatherly correction. Okay, father corrects their children, intended to impart moral discipline and character development to a child. Now, if you look at those words, they have a lot imbued in them that has to do with love. Love is a principle behind that. You want to mold the person to being a better person, obviously, to inherit good characteristics, developing a child. So that can be verbally. Physical can be in different ways, in terms of putting them through different programs, like you make them do some gardening or some working or whatever the case may be. That's part of chastening as well. So correction then becomes the primary means by which of which God reveals both his character to us and our own characters to ourselves, because God corrected the Israelites. Sometimes he let them experience a lot of things, a lot of craziness, pain and heartache and so forth, to learn ourselves. So if you love somebody, you discipline them. Discipline them means let them learn. Okay, allow them to learn, and allow them to grow. In love. Okay, in love, not to mean that kids do whatever the heck they want and come back late at night and so on. All right, so I think there are just scales and measures to having these kinds of discussions in understanding what fatherly correction is. Hence, I'm saying love and intention behind all this needs to be considered a great deal. All right, not an easy discussion to be had, but what I'm saying is, I think we got to be very careful when we start to legislate things and we start to want to police people and how they raise their children, but we don't necessarily address the injustices that are already imposed on them in terms of the societal standards, the societal and communal challenges that they are facing. I don't think that's quite fair to do that on people. Coming back to the Oprah Winfrey situation, I think there's something to learn about that. There's something interesting to learn about her experiences and what she has gone through, and just talking about child abuse, or rather child discipline and chastising and spanking, corporal punishment or whatever. Later on, she talks about something interesting that I'm going to talk about on my next video, which has to do with how that affected the way she perceives people and how she behaves and who she is as a person, and how that made her to be a person that opened herself up to being taken advantage of. I know, right? Like, the dimensions of the two conversations is kind of a little weird, but it's interesting. Okay, I'm gonna see you next on the next video today. I hope you're blessed by the word. Do like the video. Do leave a comment. Do tell me what you think. Tell me what you think about Oprah's story, and if you ever received a butt whoop with love or whatever, do let me know what you really think about the conversation. Otherwise, thanks for watching and stay blessed.